In early 2025, the global economy did not collapse. There was no single crash, no dramatic countdown, no moment when screens went dark and the world stopped spinning. Life went on. Ships still crossed oceans. Markets still opened each morning. On the surface, everything looked normal. And that was the most dangerous part, because instead of breaking, the system began to change. Quietly, gradually, permanently. The rules that had governed global trade for decades didn't disappear overnight. They were rewritten line by line, exception by exception, deal by deal. Ports stayed open, planes kept flying, stock indices ticked upward. But beneath that calm exterior, the foundations of the global economy, the invisible architecture connecting Chinese factories, American consumers, African minds, and European engineers, were being reshaped. Most people never saw it happening. To understand why 2025 mattered, you have to remember the world that entered it. It was a tired world, exhausted by a pandemic that revealed how fragile supply chains truly were, shaken by wars that drove up energy and food prices, strained by inflation that hollowed out wages while governments promised relief that never fully arrived. By January 2025, households everywhere were already stretched thin. Rent was higher, food cost more, borrowing was expensive, debt, personal, corporate, and sovereign, had piled up quietly in the background, growing heavier with every passing month. This was not a strong global economy, it was a vulnerable one. And then came the shock. In April 2025, the United States imposed sweeping new tariffs on imports from nearly every major trading partner. This was not a technical adjustment or a symbolic signal. It was the largest single disruption to global trade policy in decades. Some countries negotiated reductions, others secured exemptions. But for China, already locked in years of strategic rivalry with Washington, the message was unmistakable. Trade was no longer about efficiency, it was about power. Tariffs, once dismissed as blunt relics of the past, returned as economic weapons. And when the world's largest economy redraws the rules, everyone else is forced to respond, whether they want to or not. This was not the first time tariffs had been used, but this time everything was different. In earlier eras, tariffs landed in a world that was less interconnected. Factories were national, supply chains were shorter. Production could move without tearing entire systems apart. By 2025, that world no longer existed. A single smartphone depended on components from over a dozen countries. A car assembled in Mexico relied on parts from Asia, Europe, and the United States. A delay in one port could ripple across continents within days. Globalization had made the world efficient, but it had also made it fragile. So when tariffs landed, the real question wasn't who would be punished. It was whether the system itself could survive the shock. In the days after the announcement, fear spread quietly through markets and ministries. Analysts warned of worst-case scenarios, escalating trade wars, collapsing demand, a return to the 1930s. Some predicted immediate recession, others feared something slower and more corrosive, a breakdown of trust. Because trade doesn't just move goods, it moves confidence, and confidence, once broken, is painfully slow to rebuild. Yet the collapse never came. By mid-2025, global trade volumes were still growing, not booming, but holding. Factories kept producing, ships kept sailing, consumers kept spending. Economists reached for a word few expected to hear: resilient. The global economy, they said, had absorbed the shock. But resilience is not the same as strength. Sometimes resilience is adaptation, sometimes it is avoidance, and sometimes it is simply postponing the pain. Because while trade survived, it did not remain the same. It moved. As tariffs made direct trade more expensive, companies did what they always do. They adjusted. Production shifted from China to Southeast Asia. Supply chains rerouted through Mexico and India. Intermediate goods crossed more borders than ever before. On paper, the numbers looked stable. Underneath, the system was becoming more complex and more fragile. Where there had once been one efficient route, there were now three inefficient ones. Where there had once been predictability, there was constant recalculation. Every decision carried political risk. Every shipment became a strategic bet. This wasn't globalization ending. It was globalization mutating. As the system rewired itself, power began to move, but not evenly. Mexico emerged as a critical manufacturing hub. Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia saw exports surge. India positioned itself as the next great alternative supply chain. At the same time, China faced a harsh reality. Its direct exports to the United States collapsed. But China did not disappear. It adapted faster and more aggressively than anyone expected. By rerouting trade, subsidizing industry, and leveraging unmatched scale, China achieved something no country had ever done before: a $1 trillion trade surplus. A number so large it reshaped global markets, a surplus that exported pressure to the rest of the world, a surplus that guaranteed backlash. As technology advanced and energy systems shifted, a new race intensified, not for factories or consumers, but for materials: lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earth elements, the minerals that power electric vehicles, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence, and many of them were concentrated in one place. Africa, a continent long treated as peripheral, suddenly became central. China, the United States, and Europe all wanted access. This time, African nations were watching carefully. Raw extraction, they said, would no longer be enough. Value would have to stay. While supply chains shifted and minerals were contested, Europe faced a different pressure: security. As geopolitical risks grew, the United States pushed its allies to spend more on defense. Europe complied. Military budgets rose to record levels. But debt was already high. Public services were already strained. Voters began asking an uncomfortable question: were governments choosing weapons over welfare? And through it all, ordinary people felt the consequences first: higher prices, more expensive imports, uncertainty at work. For businesses, tariffs showed up as costs. For households, they showed up at the checkout counter. At first, the change was subtle, then it wasn't. By late 2025, a quiet anxiety had spread across economies. If this is resilience, why does it feel like struggle?
By the end of the year, one truth was impossible to ignore. The world had not returned to stability. It had entered a transition. A world where trade was political, where growth depended on debt, where technology promised both salvation and disruption, where power was shifting, but no one was fully in control. 2025 was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of a new era. And in 2026, the consequences would begin to land. Tariffs were supposed to belong to the past, to black and white photographs, to the Great Depression, to mistakes economists warned against for generations. For decades, the global consensus was clear: trade barriers make everyone poorer. So when tariffs returned, openly, aggressively, unapologetically, it signaled something deeper than policy. It marked the return of economic nationalism as a governing philosophy. Donald Trump did not invent tariffs. He revived them. With a message that felt familiar and powerful: America had been taken advantage of. Factories had left. Jobs had vanished. Trade deficits proved the system was rigged. Tariffs, he argued, would fix it. It was a simple story: emotional, politically effective. But economics rarely follows simple stories. At the heart of tariff politics lies a misunderstanding. Trade deficits are not a scoreboard. They do not mean one country is losing and another is winning. They reflect something simpler. A country that consumes more than it produces must import the difference. The United States runs deficits because it spends heavily, saves little, and attracts global capital. Tariffs do not change that, but they endure because they shift blame outward. Foreign governments, foreign factories, foreign workers. Instead of confronting automation, inequality, or financialization, tariffs offer a simpler answer. It's their fault. When the new tariff regime was announced in April, markets braced for disaster. But the final measures were lower than threatened. Deals were struck, exemptions negotiated. The system bent, but it did not break. And that bending changed everything. Because tariffs were never really about trade balances. They were about manufacturing. And manufacturing had already changed. China understood this. It dominates global manufacturing not because wages are low, but because of scale, automation, and integration. It deploys more industrial robots than any country on Earth. Its factories operate at volumes that crush competitors. Even if factories returned to the United States, jobs might not. Tariffs could bring production home. They could not bring the past back. Despite the rhetoric, tariffs are not paid by foreign countries. They are paid by importers and ultimately by consumers. The costs arrive slowly, quietly, months later. That delay is why tariffs survive politically. The benefits are immediate. The pain is deferred. But deferred pain still arrives. By 2025, trade was no longer about economics. It was leverage, a bargaining chip, a signal of power, a test of loyalty. Rules became flexible. Certainty disappeared. And once uncertainty enters the system, investment slows, not immediately, but inevitably. Countries did not retaliate directly. They adapted. They rerouted. They restructured. They worked around the system. The global economy did not split cleanly. It fractured into overlapping networks, more complex, more political, more fragile. The return of tariffs set a dangerous precedent. If the world's largest economy can rewrite the rules unilaterally, then rules become optional. Agreements become temporary. Trust becomes conditional. The old system wasn't perfect, but it was predictable. 2025 replaced predictability with power. Trade did not collapse, but it changed. It became slower, more expensive, more political. Efficiency gave way to resilience. Resilience gave way to redundancy. Redundancy raised costs. And those costs would not stay contained. They would travel through supply chains, through prices, through jobs, through households. Tariffs returned not because they worked, but because they felt right. And next, we see what happened when trade didn't break. It moved.
When tariffs were imposed, many expected a dramatic rupture in the global economy, a sudden freeze marked by empty ports, idle factories, and a worldwide slowdown that would confirm every warning economists had issued. But that collapse never came. Ships continued to sail, supply chains did not break, and global trade did not die. Instead, it moved.
For months, analysts focused on the wrong question. They asked how much trade would be destroyed, assuming commerce was a fragile structure that could simply shatter. In reality, trade behaves more like a flow. When blocked, it finds new channels. The real question was never whether trade would survive, but where it would go once the old routes were obstructed. Economists distinguish between trade destruction and trade diversion. Trade destruction means commerce disappears entirely. Trade diversion means it changes direction. What the world witnessed in 2025 was diversion on a historic scale. Goods continued to move, demand remained intact, and factories kept producing, but the familiar map of global trade no longer applied. This was most visible in U.S.-China trade. Direct Chinese exports to the United States fell sharply and in some categories appeared to collapse. On paper, this looked like a victory for tariff advocates. In reality, the products never vanished. They simply arrived through different doors. A new class of intermediaries rose to prominence. Mexico, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, India, and Taiwan all benefited. These countries did not suddenly invent new industries. They became conduits. Components were shipped from China, assembled elsewhere, and then exported onward, sometimes relabeled, sometimes minimally processed, often routed through complex legal and logistical loopholes. Trade became layered, opaque, and far harder to track. This adaptation kept the global system alive. Companies did not cancel orders, consumers avoided shortages, and governments sidestepped recession headlines. On the surface, the global economy appeared resilient. Beneath that surface, however, costs were rising. More borders meant more paperwork, more logistics meant more delays, and more intermediaries meant higher expenses. Efficiency was sacrificed for survival. No country benefited more visibly than Mexico. Its proximity to the United States, favorable trade agreements, and competitive labor costs made it uniquely positioned. Factories relocated, investment surged, and exports climbed. Mexico did not replace China, it complemented it. China remained the upstream industrial powerhouse, while Mexico became the gateway. Southeast Asia experienced a quieter boom. Vietnam emerged as one of the fastest-growing export hubs in the world, spanning electronics, textiles, and machinery. Foreign direct investment poured in, but the model had limits. These economies lacked China's scale, depended heavily on imported components, and operated on thin margins. Any further disruption could easily fracture the system. Despite political rhetoric about decoupling, reality told a different story. China never left global supply chains. Instead, it became more deeply embedded, hidden behind layers of intermediaries, disguised by geography, and woven into intermediate goods. Decoupling, in practice, became disguised dependence. Trade diversion preserved the system, but it also made it more fragile. Each additional link introduced new points of failure: strikes, conflicts, regulatory changes, or pandemics. The system survived once through adaptation, but survival is not the same as safety.
Not everyone benefited from the shift. Countries without infrastructure were bypassed, smaller manufacturers were squeezed, and consumers paid higher prices. Efficiency had long concealed inequality. Once efficiency eroded, that inequality became impossible to ignore.
By late 2025, economists described global trade as resilient. They were not wrong, but resilience built on constant improvisation is not stability. It is endurance, and endurance has limits. Trade had moved, but pressure had not disappeared. It shifted toward the countries still producing more than any other. In 2025, China crossed a historic threshold, a $1 trillion trade surplus in a single year. Not adjusted for inflation, not spread across decades, but achieved outright. For some, it signaled economic strength. For others, it was a warning, because surpluses of that magnitude reshape not just markets, but politics.
At its core, a trade surplus means exporting more than importing. At small scales, this is manageable. At China's scale, it becomes destabilizing. One economy absorbs global demand while returning little in kind. Trading partners feel the strain as factories close, margins collapse, and political backlash grows. In 2025, that pressure reached a breaking point.
China's surplus was not the result of a booming domestic economy. It was the product of weakness at home. Property investment collapsed, consumer confidence eroded, and households chose to save rather than spend. China did not import growth, it exported survival. For decades, real estate had powered China's expansion. Local governments depended on land sales, households stored wealth in apartments, and developers borrowed endlessly. By the early 2020s, the model unraveled. Projects stalled, debt exploded, and confidence vanished. By 2025, real estate was no longer an engine of growth. It was a drag. Savings did not disappear, they were redirected. Capital flowed into manufacturing, technology, and state-supported strategic sectors such as electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, industrial machinery, and semiconductors. China did not slow down. It doubled down. The problem was excess capacity. China produced far more than it could consume domestically. Margins collapsed, competition intensified, and prices fell. The only escape was external. China exported its excess capacity to the world, rapidly, massively, and at prices competitors struggled to match. Subsidies played a central role. China's industrial system is guided rather than purely market-driven. Subsidies reduce costs, credit remains cheap, and local governments protect employers. Firms can survive losses that would bankrupt competitors elsewhere, creating structural imbalances in global markets. Currency dynamics reinforced this advantage. Even when the yuan appreciated, it often lagged behind peer currencies. A relatively cheaper currency made exports more competitive and imports more expensive, widening surpluses. Trading partners noticed and reacted. By late 2025, backlash was visible. Europe accused China of flooding markets. Asian manufacturers lost market share, and developing economies struggled to compete. Protectionism did not fade, it spread. Behind the anger was a deeper fear. China was not specializing in a narrow set of industries. It was competing across all of them, high-tech and low-tech, capital-intensive and labor-intensive. No global system can absorb that level of pressure indefinitely. Surpluses of this size inevitably create enemies. They invite tariffs, regulations, and political resistance. China understands this reality. The open question is whether it can rebalance its economy, or whether it is trapped by its own success. As China searched for inputs and influence, its gaze turned outward toward Africa for minerals, markets, and partnerships. This time, however, Africa responded with greater awareness of its leverage. China's surplus was more than an economic milestone. It was a fault line. Along that fault line, a new global scramble began, not for factories, but for the raw materials that will power the future. And as trade routes were rerouted, something extraordinary occurred. China posted a surplus so vast that it shook global markets, triggering backlash, fear, and the next phase of global conflict.